morning, everyone. This is Amy Sterndale from the Carsey Institute, University of New Hampshire. I am going to be introducing our webinar today and going through a little bit of housekeeping. You've signed up for a webinar on child poverty in the wake of economic recovery with Mary Beth Mattingly and Jessica Bean. We're going to be talking about the research we released yesterday and going through some further analysis of the data. A couple of quick things. We want to open this up to questions at the end of the webinar today. The researchers will speak for probably about 30 minutes or so on their findings, but you have a box in the bottom right corner of your screen where you should be able to post questions at any time. Please feel free to use that throughout the webinar as you think of questions you have, and we'll address those as we can towards the end. We do plan on recording this webinar and posting it online next week. We'll send out an email when that is live, and you can share it with your colleagues. Due to some technical issues, it appears that Amy Sterndale, myself, is going to be talking throughout the entire webinar, but we'll introduce each of the speakers as we go. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mary Beth Mattingly. She's the Director of Research on Vulnerable Families at the Carsey Institute.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us this morning. As Amy mentioned, the title today is Child Poverty in the Wake of Economic Recovery. And we're going to present findings from the American Community Survey data released just yesterday by the U.S. Census Bureau. Today's talk is going to start with an introduction to poverty and the data that we use. Then I'm going to speak about child poverty by region, place type, and state. At that point, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jessica Bean, who's going to talk about children at different levels of the poverty threshold. And she's specifically going to focus on kids who we consider to be living in deep poverty, some of the most disadvantaged children living below 50% of the poverty line, and also looking above the poverty line at children in families who may still be struggling to meet their basic needs, families below 200% of poverty. And then she's also going to talk about some other demographic correlates of poverty. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the official poverty threshold defined by the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. It varies by family size and composition, but for a two-parent, two-child family in 2011, the threshold was listed as $22,811. And most of our talk and most of our research this week has really focused on child poverty. And we do this for a couple of reasons. The most pressing is that the consequences of child poverty last and ripple through the life course. We see kids who grow up poor tend to have lower quality health later in life, have worse cognitive outcomes, and riskier social outcomes, things such as delinquency and higher risk of teen pregnancy. And these risks are all greatest the younger children are when they're poor. So when children are very young, the risks later in life are greatest if they experience poverty, even if they exit poverty later on. Another reason we focus on child poverty, not just are these kids most likely to suffer down the road, but they have the highest rates of child poverty. We show in this slide the poverty rate by age across time since poverty was first measured in 1959. And you see that around 1974, that top line for 65 years and older flipped with the next line, which is under age 18. And since that time, child poverty has been higher than working age adult poverty or than poverty for the 65 and older population. And if we were to break that line down further, we would see that the young child poverty rate for those under age 6 is even higher than the under age 18. And just to avoid any confusion, about 2 weeks ago, the Census Bureau released estimates from the current population survey. This is a different data source, the American Community Survey, which was released just yesterday, and it samples a much larger swath of the population, capturing about 3 million addresses each year. This allows for examination of poverty among groups that can't really be observed with the CPS data, so we can look at reliable state-level estimates, look at regional estimates and regional estimates for rural, suburban, and urban kids, and so forth. So our first graph gives an overall picture of the increases in child poverty since the recession began in 2007. And you see these bars refer to the number of children living in poverty in millions. So between 2007 and 2010, we saw an increase from about 13.1 million children in poverty to 15.7, representing an almost 20% increase. And then just between 2010 and 2011, we saw an additional 4.5% of children living in poverty, for an estimated 16.4 million children in poverty in 2011. Excuse me. This slide displays our first glimpse at the subnational 2011 child poverty estimates. States colored darker have higher poverty rates. And you'll notice that the lowest value on our legend is 12%. The state with the lowest child poverty is New Hampshire, and that rate is 12%. States with horizontal bars are those which experienced increases, statistically significant increases in child poverty since 2010, and the crosshatched symbols experienced declines over that period. While poverty fell in 5 states plus the District of Columbia between 2010 and 2011, in no state has poverty fallen below its pre-recession rate. The state with the lowest poverty rate I mentioned was New Hampshire at 12%, and the highest rate was in Mississippi, where nearly 32% of kids are living in poverty. In terms of the change, the one-year change between 2010 and 2011, Hawaii saw the largest increase, up from 13.9% in 2010 to 17% in 2011. And Vermont is the state that realized the largest decrease by nearly 2 percentage points in the same year. This slide demonstrates the variation in child poverty by region. All regions experienced increases in child poverty over time, and you can see the 2007 light blue bar is lower for all regions than the dark blue bar for 2010, and then the gray bar for 2011. And you see the United States child poverty rate, according to the American Community Survey data, was 22.5% in 2011 on the left-hand side. This compares to a low of 18.8% in the Northeast and a high of over 25% in the South in 2011. Next, I turn to looking at differences across place type in rural, suburban, and central city America. And you see the same pattern of increases over time that we saw for the regions is evident across place types. And the real takeaway from this message is that child poverty rates are much higher in central cities and rural America than in the suburbs. But it's important to note that given America's population composition, more poor kids live in suburban America and central cities than in rural America. Now I turn to young children. You'll recall I defined this as children under age 6, so we're really looking at the preschool age years primarily. In 2007, nearly 5 million American children under age 6 were poor, and that accounted for about 3 in 10 of America's poor children. But by 2010, this had increased by 19.1% to 5.9 million. And between 2010 and 2011, an additional 3.1% increase meant that 6.1 million of the youngest Americans were poor. And as we did for all child poverty, we show the regional variation in young child poverty. And the trends are exactly the same, but the bars are taller because young children have higher poverty rates. And I just want to highlight the South, where 28.4% of young kids are poor, and the Northeast still has more than 1 in 5 young children living in poverty. And finally, we show the percent of young children in poverty by place type, and you see that suburban poverty is the lowest, higher than it was for all children at just 19.7%, but rural poverty is next at 30.8% for young kids, which is close to the high for central cities at 31.8%. So that gives you an overall snapshot of poverty, kids below that official poverty threshold in 2011, and how things have changed in 1 year and 4 years. Next, my colleague Jessica Bean is going to talk about those kids who may be struggling the most, living in families with income below half the poverty line. And then also looking at kids who may be slightly better off, but in families still really struggling to meet their day-to-day needs, up to 200% of poverty, conceptualized in this presentation as low-income families. Jessica?
Thank you, Beth. So up until now, we've discussed rates of child poverty. In this slide, however, we consider the percent of children who live below half the poverty line. And in 2011, that translates into $11,406 for a family with 2 adults and 2 children. These represent the most disadvantaged children, the ones that may be at the highest risk for long-term negative outcomes. In this table, we see that nationwide, 1 in 10 children lives in this type of deep poverty, with even higher rates in the South. The Northeast has the lowest rates of deep child poverty at 8.7%. In all regions of the U.S., there have been significant increases in the rate of children in deep poverty, both since the recession began in 2007 and since 2010. An additional way of thinking about children in need is to consider those who live below twice the poverty line. While the poverty threshold is the official measure of need in this country, research suggests that nationwide, families need incomes of between 1.5 and 3.5 times the poverty threshold to meet their housing, food, childcare, medical, and transportation needs. In 2011, 200% of the poverty threshold was equivalent to $45,622 for a 2-parent, 2-child family. As with the previous map, we see that the states with higher rates of children living in these quote-unquote low-income homes are shaded in the darkest blue. Overall, 9 states saw increases in the percent of children in low-income homes, while one place, Washington, D.C., saw a substantial decrease over the year. The states with the highest rates of low-income children are Mississippi at 59% and New Mexico at 58%, while New Hampshire is home to the lowest proportion of low-income children at 29%. The largest one-year increase came in Alaska, where rates rose from 31.5% to 39.5% between 2010 and 2011. So far, we've examined rates of poverty, deep poverty, and low income for children. In these next slides, however, we turn to some poverty rates among particular demographic groups, which can help us to contextualize these child poverty numbers. With a deeper understanding of who is likely to be poor, we're better able to understand the landscape in which poor children are living. So this slide examines poverty rates by family type, specifically for families with children under the age of 18. On the left-hand side, we see that among all families with children, the poverty rate was 19% in 2011. For married couples with children, the family poverty rate is less than half that at just 9%. For female-headed households with children, more than 4 in 10 single-mother families are living in poverty. These trends are similar over time, though the growth in poverty rates was fastest among female-headed households, both since 2007 when the recession began and between 2010 and 2011. This slide displays poverty rates for different ethnicities and races by family type among families with children. Perhaps most striking of all is that in all family types, white respondents consistently have the lowest poverty rates. This finding held true across all years and in all regions as well. Across all races and ethnicities, poverty was highest among female-headed households, with 41% of Hispanic single-mother families experiencing poverty in 2011. This compares to just 24% of white female-headed households. Note that the Census Bureau did not provide breakdowns for male-headed households with children. Sample sizes for this population are too small, as only 1 in 5 single-parent homes is headed by a male. This graph addresses poverty rates by educational attainment of the householder for all families in 2011. That year, nearly 3 in 10, or 29.5%, of people without a high school diploma were in poverty. Among those with a high school degree or equivalent, 14.5% were poor. Just over 1 in 10 of those with some college or an associate's degree were poor, while respondents with a bachelor's degree or higher were the least likely to be poor, at just 3.1% in 2011. These patterns of poverty by educational attainment are nearly identical between regions, and they're remarkably consistent over time. Our final figure demonstrates the poverty status of individuals aged 16 and older by various employment arrangements. Note that these employment statuses refer to the respondent status in the week before the questionnaire was completed. Unsurprisingly, those who are employed have the lowest poverty rates across all years at just 7.4% by 2011. Those who are not in the labor force have the next highest poverty rate at 21.8% in 2011, up from 19.5% in 2007. This group encompasses a wide variety of non-workers, including the disabled, stay-at-home parents, non-working students, or those who have given up searching for work, who could also be termed discouraged workers. Finally, those who are unemployed have the highest poverty rates of all, with nearly a third, or 32.6%, experiencing poverty in 2011. This figure reveals several notable things. First, those who are unemployed or without a job but actively looking for work have alarmingly high poverty rates. Also worth pointing out is that though unemployed people have a very high rate, it's actually the employed people who experienced the largest increase in poverty during the recession, proportionately speaking. That is, while those who were unemployed experienced an increase in poverty of 17%, those who were employed had poverty rates 23% higher in 2011 than before the recession began. This could be the case because those who are employed may have experienced a decline in real wages, maybe working fewer hours, or it could be a combination of both. So in conclusion, what did we learn today? We learned that in 2011, poverty continued to rise for children, for young children, and others. In 2011, more than 1 in 4, or 25.6% of young children, were poor. 1 in 10 children lived in deep poverty, and 45% of children lived in families with incomes less than twice the poverty line. So if the recession ended in 2009 and unemployment peaked in October of that year, why has poverty continued to rise? We can speculate that this is the case for several reasons. First, the American Community Survey data asked people to recall their income for a year prior to the questionnaire. And since people answer the questionnaire all year long, the reference period, or the period that people are asked to refer back to, spans 23 months. Thus, this period encompasses some times when unemployment was still quite high. If some of the child poverty increases are an artifact of this questionnaire structure, it's possible that we will see child poverty rates begin to decline in 2012. In addition, however, the nation has experienced a very slow recovery from the effects of the recession. Unemployment is certainly higher than its pre-recession rates, even today, and families and children are likely still feeling these effects. If the economy continues its recovery into 2012, it may also impact the rates we see in next year's release.
So thank you for your presentation, Beth and Jess. We want to invite people to add questions. In the bottom right corner of your screen, we have there should be a question box where you can add some questions. We've already had a few come in that I think have been answered throughout the course of the presentation. But if you can add some others now, I think we have one here from Jason Flom asking about what actions should this information lead us toward as Americans, voters, educators, and some combination thereof?
I think this information sheds light on what's happening in American families and can be used to inform perspectives. These data suggest that a large swath of America's children are in families that are struggling, and I'm particularly taken by the increases in poverty among the employed and also the high rates among the unemployed. I think it's really important. The unemployed are people who are actively looking and actively wanting to work and unable to find a position. So I think it really speaks to some of the things we need to consider as a nation going forward.
A couple people have asked about whether the slides will be posted. We will. We'll put them up as a PDF next week. A lot of the data in these slides, some of it is in the brief that you should already have. If you haven't read the brief, it is available on the homepage of CARSI's website, which is carciinstitute.unh.edu, or in the publications field. Some additional findings we found since we released it yesterday, and those will be in the PDF we'll put out with the webinar on probably next Monday or Tuesday. We should be able to get that up, and we'll send you on an email with it. Alaska. So we have a question from Alaska, and the population is small in Alaska, and therefore averages from one year to another can indicate drastic increases and decreases when measuring yearly poverty numbers. How do you adjust for a more accurate measure?
I think I would say, rather than putting too much faith in the point estimate, looking at whether or not the margin of error overlaps with last year, and it does not. So we do see in Alaska that there was a significant increase in child poverty, and that has been tested statistically.
In addition, I think it's important to look at child poverty in multiple ways. So for example, throughout this presentation, we looked at percent of poverty, we looked at percent increase, percentage point change, and also numbers of children in poverty. So using multiple measures that way can help sort of adjust for some of the variation in state-to-state population.
There are a few other questions here that probably aren't right for this audience that we can't answer today. Oh, here comes another one. Are there any categories of data on poverty levels in the ACS for children who live with grandparents?
I think that I don't believe that that's available yet. When the microdata are released, either later this year or early next, we might be able to look at that depending on sample sizes.
Another question, is there poverty data available for all sizes of municipalities?
Yes, but not necessarily. Well, I should say I believe so, but not necessarily for one-year estimates. The smaller the location that you're looking at, the greater the number of years you'll have to combine to get estimates.
And speaking to that point, the American Community Survey 3-year estimates are a great resource for some of the smaller geographies, and those will be released in October. And then the 5-year estimates are available for all geographies. Those will be released in December of this year.
Fantastic. There's a few questions here that are a little more political where we won't ask the researchers to weigh in on those. But if you think of something after the end of the webinar, we'll record this and put it up online. You can share with your colleagues. We certainly appreciate you passing on the work these folks have done here. But you can also email Beth Mattingly and Jessica Bean at any time. They're easy to find on our website, and we'll also, you've got their emails on your screen at this time. Thanks again for attending today's webinar on child poverty in the wake of economic recovery, and we'll see you next time.